Well, folks, uh, good morning. Let me welcome you to another session of the online classes that we are taking. As you all know, from today, I am going to start another topic. In today's lecture, I am going to introduce Out of Place by Edward W. Said. Now, before I start my discussion of Out of Place, the memoir of Edward Said, the lifespan of Edward Said was 1935 to 2003. And this memoir was written and published in 1999. So before we talk about Out of Place, we have to tell you something about Edward Said. Edward Said is well known as a post-colonial critic. He was a great theoretician who is considered to be one of the big three of post-colonial theory, along with Homike Bhabha and Gayatri Chakraborty's Vivak. Edward Said was born in Jerusalem. Edward Said was the son of Wadi Ibrahim Said, a Lebanese Christian, and Hilda Musa Said. Edward Said was born into an elite class, but at the same time, he was born into a class of misfits. Even though he was Arab, he was Christian. So in a Muslim majority society, he was obviously a misfit, someone out of place. Edward Said was at a comparatively young age, in 1948 to be precise, first brought to Cairo. Hello. Classes. Edward Said's family was brought to Cairo, and this actually led to another sense of alienation. He was educated in Victoria College, Cairo, where in a way he felt out of place. He was a precocious child, a very bright student. But at the same time, he was neither here nor there. Christian, but not westernized. Not Western, a Westerner. Arab, but not Muslim. Similarly, based in Egypt, but not an Egyptian. Said says that he thought he looked Arab, all right, and spoke like an Arab. But there was something indefinable, undefinable, that seemed to give him away. So again, an odd man. Later on, he was brought to the United States, studied in Princeton and Harvard, and in 1963 joined Columbia University as a lecturer. In 1967, he became an assistant professor of Columbia University. He was into English and comparative literature departments. Then in 1969, he became a professor. From 1977 onwards, he started holding endowed chairs of one kind or another in different places. He was closely attached to Columbia University, but he was a visiting professor at different places. Now, since you have already known Edward Said as the writer of Orientalism, which was on your syllabus in semester 3, you must know that 1978 saw the publication of one of the most important works of criticism and theory that dealt with the problem and prospects of representation of the East. Yes, I am talking about Orientalism. Now, Orientalism is still the defining work of Edward Said. Now, who was Edward Said? Was he only a literary critic? Was he only a culture critic? Was he only a social critic? Yes, he was these. But along with this, he was also a political activist. He was a staunch supporter of the Palestinian people's right to self-governance. He became a member of the Palestinian Assembly in Exile, the National Council. Even though he was all for a non-violent resolution of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, he could not see eyeball to eyeball with the Oslo peace process that led to the now historic agreement between Yasser Arafat from the Fatah faction of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin from the Israeli side. He resigned from the National Council. Now, since he was a lifelong enthusiast to find out the dynamics of representation, along with his activism in support of the Palestinian issue. He was also interested in how the media represents Islam. We all know that a large section of the Orientalism, of the book Orientalism, deals with how the West has historically dealt with the East. And while dealing with the East, on the discursive plane of representation, now, Said has discussed in detail about the way Islam and the Muslim are represented. So he has extensively dealt with how the media covers Islam and the Muslim countries. Now here, you have to understand that he was an Arab Christian. But because he was Arab, that Arab part of his sensibility helped him in at least trying to understand the way in which Islam is represented, the way in which the Muslims are represented by the West and in the West. Now, along with this, Edward Said was also an accomplished musician, a pianist of great dexterity. His choice of the musical instrument is also, in a way, symptomatic of the great depth of his cosmopolitan nature. He has experimented with fusion of the Eastern and the Western in music. Now, along with the trauma of being displaced, along with the trauma of seeing one half or one part of humanity turning against another part in irrational hatred that led to the Gulf War, and later on that led to the rise of Muslim fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, and that led to the wholesale denigration of the Muslims by a brood of brash categorizers. Towards the fag end of his life, Edward Said was unfortunately made to be a witness to both the 9/11 attacks and its resultant I should not say resultant, because that is another debate, whether the war on terror engaged in by the West against the Al-Qaeda, against countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, was actually occasioned only by the 9/11 attacks. So let me rephrase my statement. Said was also a witness to not only the 9/11 attack, but also a subsequent war on terror apparently caused by the suspicion of weapons of mass destruction being hidden in such technologically less developed or least developed countries, especially as Afghanistan, and also to some extent Iraq, which had been shattered and battered by the two Gulf Wars and so on and so forth. Another aspect of Said's life needs to be taken into consideration. That is the threat of illness. Said's father, Said's mother, and Said himself, they were all stricken down by cancer. Cancer of different types. But you know, Said was a fighter. So, even though momentarily he was assailed by the doubt, the pioneers of doubt, the fear of not returning, eventually, however, he was bolstered by, he was supported by the pioneers' urge for setting out. Now, Said has written about Joseph Conrad and the fiction of photography, which was basically his PhD doctoral dissertation, which was ultimately published as a monograph. One of his more important works is also Culture and Imperialism, in which he has talked about the way in which the relationship between culture of both the imperialist and of the empire get suffused by the colonial encounter. Now, out of place came at the fag end of his life. Already he had received the proverbial death sentence after being diagnosed with lymphatic leukemia. So, Said was trying to situate his life. And his life, in a way, became symptomatic of the historical, cultural, as well as intellectual encounter between the East and the West. His alienation, sense of alienation from the communities that he visited and settled in, ultimately, leaves him always as an odd man out. And we are going to deal with this aspect of Said's personality that comes out clear when we read the memoir Out of Place. How places, their topographies, their histories, their cultures, their strengths and weaknesses of all kinds lead to the shaping of someone's consciousness, especially when that someone is as intellectually alive and as well read as Edward Said. That is what we see in Out of Place. For example, let's think about when almost 5 decades afterwards, Said actually revisits the country of his birth. How the distance in time changes the place that one had once known. Is to be very, very methodically brought out when you read Out of Place. Similarly, an instance in Cairo's Victoria College, where at the age of 15, Said was temporarily expelled for getting into the scrape with his hectoring, incompetent English teacher, Low, and also the unsure and yet self-opinionated and self-important Griffith, his temporary headmaster. Said had locked Low in a windowed cubicle and ironically described him, that is Low, as being in his natural state. Later on, there is a very, very interesting conversation between Griffith and Said's parents. In which the school authorities point out that the bright student had not been sacked long before only because of his superior intellectual accomplishments. But at the same time, expressing their annoyance at the many pranks, superiority of the young Said became a threat to the ossified authority of the school teachers, shaped Said's own attitude towards teaching, because he ultimately became a great teacher as well. Now, in our discussion of autoplay, we are going to deal with certain aspects of this. I have already supplied you with certain discussion topics. I've already supplied you with 6 discussion topics, I think. So from next day onwards, I am going to deal with the topics one by one. And in the process, I will give you some idea of what the text is all about as well. Incidentally, I have also provided you with a soft copy of the text. So I will strongly recommend that you guys get acquainted with a memoir out of place. Its text and contexts. I have provided you with study materials and a few articles as well. So I think you will be able to follow my discussion. With this, we come to the end of today's discussion.